happens when one of our most popular modern-day artists makes a movie that's equal parts Pokemon, Summer Wars, and even a little Godzilla for good measure? You get Takashi Murakami's Jellyfish Eyes, a movie that, despite its cute creatures and hopeful message, almost managed to destroy one of the most popular modern-day contemporary artists. If you don't know Murakami's name, you certainly know his work. You've probably seen his iconic flower. He's responsible for the art direction for Billie Eilish's You Should See Me in a Crown video, but what you most likely know him for is this.
Good morning.
That's right. Along with designing the album cover for Kanye West's graduation album, he also directed the iconic Good Morning music video and of course designed the even more iconic Dropout Bear. Murakami is a master of so many different mediums, including painting, drawing, and sculpture. Along with that, he's managed to build a very successful commercial enterprise, making everything from designer clothes, digital pets, and more. He's collaborated with Louis Vuitton, Supreme, Vans, and Crocs, just to name a few. Murakami graduated from the Tokyo University of the Arts in 1988. Originally wanting to be an animator, he would go on to switch his major to Nihonga, a traditional style of Japanese painting that incorporated traditional Japanese artistic conventions, techniques, and subjects. However, that also wouldn't last. Murakami found Nihongo to be deeply constraining and limiting to his growth as an artist. In an interview with Artsy, he's quoted as saying, "Nihongo was not a genre where potential talent could blossom. Content-wise, the paintings were inferior imitations of impressionist works. It was all politics, with a very few artists cherry-picked by galleries and award organizations, constantly vying for power. Getting tangled in such politics, young artists had no room to exercise their talents." One day, Murakami saw a solo exhibition by the artist Shinto Otake, a contemporary artist, and was completely blown away. He decided to dedicate himself to contemporary art, even though he knew that he would be fighting an uphill battle, as there wasn't much of a market for it in Japan at the time. I think something that sets Murakami apart from a lot of other fine artists is his influence from other, you could say, more commercial and widely distributed art forms like cartoons and movies. When asked about his early influences, he often talks a lot about anime, Star Wars, and even has a really charming story about making illegal copies of Michael Jackson's Thriller video that he imported from America. Knowing this makes the trajectory of his career and the populist appeal of it make a lot more sense. Murakami is often critiqued for the commercialization of his work. After all, you can get just about any product you can think of with his iconic flowers on it, even water. But when you consider his influences, the merchandising is almost built into it in a way, and one could even argue that by buying into these products, we're almost becoming part of the message of the art by taking part in the consumerist tendencies Murakami's work so often critiques. Murakami would name his particular movement of art Superflat, which aims to acknowledge and celebrate the interactions between high and low art, but also aims to explore the consumerism that he claims became so prevalent in post-war Japan. Murakami had built an incredibly successful empire for himself. Having conquered the fine art and merchandising worlds, there was one that continued to elude him. One that went all the way back to that original dream of wanting to be an animator. The world of feature films. In March 2011, Japan was hit with both an earthquake and a tsunami. The two events caused massive damage, including to the Fukushima nuclear power plant. In the face of the destruction, Japan's government also came under heavy scrutiny for how it responded to the tragedy. Government agencies failed to correspond with one another, people were forced from their homes, and in the months afterwards, a pattern of corruption and incompetence would come to light that would highlight how avoidable much of the damage could have been. Murakami, like many of his countrymen, understandably felt let down by the government's response, and felt that the people of Japan were in need of a story to help people make sense of their feelings and anxieties about both natural disasters and the fallout of them. He began work on his first feature, Jellyfish Eyes. Yoshihiro Nishimura would come on to help Murakami produce Jellyfish Eyes, And in the making of documentary on the Criterion release of Jellyfish Eyes, Nishimura, a successful filmmaker in his own right, reveals that he had actually always wanted to see Murakami make a movie. You can tell that there's a deep respect and admiration between the two of them. In order to have full creative control, Murakami decided to self-finance the movie and release it through his company Kaikai Kikiko. This meant that if it succeeded, well, awesome. All that success would be his. But if it failed, well, all that would be on him and his company. But let's not get ahead of ourselves there. Nishimura endorsed the choice to have Kaikai Kikiko fund the movie as well. He didn't want Murakami to do it through the traditional studio system because he wanted Murakami to have the experience of what it's like to truly make a movie, where he'd really need to roll up his sleeves and make choices and be thoroughly involved in the process. He didn't want him surrounded by a bunch of yes men who did everything for him. However, this would lead to mixed results. Murakami is a visual artist used to mostly working with just himself and maybe a few assistants. However, movies are highly collaborative, and when you take into account that the movie was for the most part shot on location and that most of its cast were young children, everything had to be accounted for to a T. In the making of documentary of Jellyfish Eyes, you can see Murakami becoming both overwhelmed and also kind of annoyed with the process of making a movie. And a lot of times Nishimura has to be the one to step up and be the final decision maker, or get Murakami to buckle down and make the decisions himself. This attitude even extended to crafting the narrative of the movie. There's a key moment highlighted in the documentary where Murakami, Nishimura, and the production staff are ironing out the story and ultimately deciding what they want it to be. They're trying to expand on what exactly is happening during the friend ritual that the bad guys are performing. And Murakami, who is used to representing things, will say, more nebulously, doesn't really feel the need to explain it much more than what he's written. However, the writing staff and Nishimura are telling him that it's not just of explaining things for the sake of it, but because they don't understand what's happening. And if they don't understand what's happening, the audience isn't going to understand what's happening. Now, given the final product, I'm going to assume that they reached some sort of compromise, but that it leaned much more heavily in Murakami's favor. Because even as a fan of this movie, I'm not sure even I understand the summoning ritual, to be honest. It seems like this attitude extended through the entire production too. Nishimura clearly wants to see his friend succeed and to use his unique voice to make a movie, but is also facing the reality that Murakami's indecision and lack of experience is putting them up against the clock. I get the feeling that Nishimura thought Murakami would get on set and get inspired and jump into action. But what it seems happened is that the overwhelming number of things to account for when making a movie and the number of people he had to have answers for overwhelmed Murakami, and he instead leaned on Nishimura more and more. There are even times when they're on set and Nishimura is the one giving the actors direction while Murakami observes. Now, to Murakami's credit, as the documentary goes along, it seems like he eventually embraced the beautiful chaos that is movie making. Some of my favorite clips are him interacting with the young stars of the movie, showing them how they would hold hands, or when he goes to visit the workshops where the maquettes of the friends are being made, and at one point he just takes the sculpting tool from the artist and starts showing them exactly how he wants something to look. It's little moments like this where you get to see Murakami the artist really jump out, and there's an excitement in him that feels really infectious. I think it's clear to Murakami that the most exciting parts of the movie making process to him are the pre-production creative bits. After all, he designed about 200 friends all himself for the movie. But the thing with making a movie is that you can't pick and choose, especially as a director, which parts you like or which parts you don't like to do. You sort of need to be involved with all of it. So for all the troubled production, how is the actual movie itself? Listen, I love it, but it's a pretty mixed bag. It's also incredibly sincere, and I can't help myself but smile when I'm watching it. This is one of those movies that I genuinely love, but I also fully acknowledge every flaw and blemish that it has. For one thing, the movie tries to juggle a lot in its 1 hour and 41 minute runtime. There's the main plot about Masashi moving to town, learning about the friends, and bonding with Karagebo, while also dealing with the loss of his father. And for the most part, that main plot is pretty good, particularly Masashi's bond with Karagebo. Takuro Sueka does a great job through his performance selling the relationship with this little creature, and Karagebo himself is so strange and so cute that I fell in love with him right away. In fact, in the realm of strange little guys that Murakami has designed, I'd say Karagebo is probably one of my favorites. But then there's everything else that the movie attempts to tackle. Take Masashi's uncle Naoto, who we're led to believe is very close to Masashi, but the two hardly have any interaction in the movie, and we never really see that relationship properly outside of a few scenes to really buy into it. In the 11th hour, the movie also introduces an orphan boy named Ko, whose friend is Murakami's pre-existing anime girl character Miss Ko 2. This character is lonely and isolated and has basically dedicated himself to getting good at friend fighting, and nothing else. This character is definitely Murakami's critique of otaku culture and the obsessive, isolating nature of it, a theme he's touched on in his artwork in the past. But the problem is that the character gets introduced so late in the game, and his problems get solved so quickly that what could have been a really interesting character never really reaches its full potential. I actually see a world where Masashi, Saki, and Ko are the main trio of this movie, and the movie focuses on them. That way we get to spend more time with Ko and Ko too. This was easily the character that I wish we had gotten to know more and spend more time with. The movie is filled with examples of good ideas that never really get explored to their fullest extent. Still, that being said, there's a lot of good stuff in Jellyfish Eyes to me that makes it really unique and worth watching. For one thing, I really think the movie does a fantastic job balancing a very somber yet dreamy-like tone. It's a very nuanced peek into what childhood is like after a big life-altering event, and I think it has a lot of interesting things to say about how adults can be held back by not processing their own trauma, and how without realizing it, it can become the responsibilities of the children in their lives to put on a happy face and keep going, or in the case of a character like Saki, become stern and cold as a form of self-preservation, after her mom ends up becoming involved in a cult-like religion as a way of making sense of the natural disasters and the resulting fallout. I'll always respect when a movie for children has the guts to tackle the more ugly parts of life, because at the end of the day, the sad thing is that children have to deal with that stuff too, and it does us no good to sugarcoat that for them. I think stories that attempt to present things like this in an appropriate and digestible fashion are invaluable, especially in the world that we're living in right now. The movie also looks great. There are a lot of reviews out there that really ragged on the camera work, and I gotta say, I just sort of disagree with that fully. Sure, the movie has big I'm making my first movie energy, and some of the shots look like they're out of your best friend's first music video, but to me that perfectly matches the really youthful spirit of Jellyfish Eyes. I'm not sure if this makes sense, but I feel like the movie is very sincere in its aesthetics. Its creature designs are wacky and varied, and in the case of characters like Luxor, are even presented in entirely different mediums. It's a movie with a ton of influences and a big heart that it wears on its sleeve, and that's something that I'll always appreciate. So, how did Jellyfish Eyes do upon its release in April 2013? Well, like I hinted at before, not great. While I couldn't find exact box office numbers, every outlet that I did search through declared it a box office bomb in Japan, and it didn't review much better either. Between the rocky production and bombing at the box office, it's safe to say that Jellyfish Eyes, while a really fun experiment, was a massive blow to Murakami and Kaikai Kikiko. Still, this was a world that Murakami seemed dedicated to, and despite poor box office and poor reviews, he began work on a sequel right away. So, how was Jellyfish Eyes 2? Well, I'd tell you if it ever actually came out. Despite going into production before Part 1 was even out of post-production and doing some reshoots in 2013, Jellyfish Eyes 2 remained in post-production hell for years afterwards, with Murakami officially declaring the movie dead in 2020. Now, the quoted reason for the movie being dead was the COVID-19 pandemic. However, production wrapped on the movie almost 7 years prior. So, what really happened to Jellyfish Eyes 2? Well, Murakami actually shared a 12-part documentary explaining everything. We don't have time to break down what happened exactly, but long story short is that instead of taking time to learn some lessons from the trials and tribulations of the first movie, he wanted to keep the momentum going and launched right into the sequel. And while he was way more involved with the production of this movie, he was still having a lot of the same problems with part 2 that he was having with part 1. After wrapping the initial filming, he realized that the movie was sort of a mess and needed reshoots, which he would begin in 2013. Only this time with an entirely new crew and co-director. That's right, he replaced Nishimura, who had stuck by him for all of part 1 and the initial round of shooting for part 2 with Shinzo Katayama. For as big of a fan of Murakami as I am, this was a strange moment for me because while I can respect the need for a fresh perspective on a project, I have a hard time coming to terms with someone who would just turn their back on a crew and a friend that, to be quite frank, had to pick up a lot of slack from someone as indecisive and as inexperienced as Murakami. I will say that to Murakami's credit, not only is he very upfront with all parts of this process, the good, the bad, and the ugly, he also seems to really regret how things went down. As Murakami's goals and ambitions for Jellyfish Eyes 2 grew and grew, costs would continue to rise and rise, which would continue to delay production. When production started on Jellyfish Eyes 2, they anticipated about 600 to 700 CG shots in the movie, but that ballooned to 1,400 when all was said and done. The animation studio that was in charge of the film's final sequence, for instance, said it took them 5 years to get it where Murakami wanted because he kept asking for more and more transformations from the characters and more changes to how the scene was happening. What started as a fight between 2 kaiju with 2 models for each transformation morphed into this insane apocalyptic beatdown where each kaiju all of a sudden had 6 models for their various transformations. By the time that the movie was more or less in a place where people were happy with it, the COVID-19 pandemic would hit. Murakami through Kaikai Kikiko had sunk so much money into the movie with work still to be done, but with the world shut down and the economy at a standstill, Kaikai Kikiko would actually end up facing bankruptcy, and Murakami would have to stop pouring money into the project. Jellyfish Eyes 2 would never come to be. While Murakami says he wants to get the movie out there someday, I remain doubtful. As much as I would genuinely like to see it, from what we have seen, stuff seems pretty cool, especially Karagebo Kaiju. If there's anything to be learned from the situation with Jellyfish Eyes, I think it's the importance of balance. When pursuing something as monumental as a feature film, you can't be a passive wallflower. You need to be a strong voice for your cast and crew to look toward. But on the other hand, when you do find that voice, you can't get so wrapped up in your own vision that you never see the project towards the finish line. Sometimes you need to know when to call it. As an artist myself, trust me, I get it. Knowing when to let go of a piece is really hard. But despite whether or not Jellyfish Eyes 2 would have been received the same way Jellyfish Eyes 1 was, I still think Murakami would be more at peace with himself if the movie was at least out there to speak for itself. Good, bad, somewhere in between, I think we as artists are always better off when we're sharing our work with people. Warts and all.